Today I'm going to show you, it's so hard once I start recording. Today I'm going to show you how to shoot manual mode, and I'm going to try and do it within 5 minutes. The whole reason I feel like it should only take 5 minutes to learn this is it's really not that hard. The most important thing is that you practice with it. Really understanding what aperture and shutter speed and ISO does takes you going out into the field in practicing. Whether it's around your house, you can go outdoors, it doesn't matter, just practice with it. And I'm gonna show some examples later on how all of these 3 pillars actually affect your image. So first, let's go over aperture. An aperture is the opening inside of your lens that controls how much light actually goes through it and hits the sensor. You can think of it kind of like your pupil. So before I shoot, what I think about first is my subject and what am I shooting. If I'm shooting a portrait or something, or a headshot of somebody, then I typically want to go for kind of that nice blown out background. I'll keep it at a lower f-stop. So on one extreme, a higher f-stop will let less light into the camera and darken your image, but it will make your depth of field very large. More items in focus, more subject in focus. On the other extreme, a lower f-stop number widens that aperture and allows more light to pop out and separate itself from the background. You can see in this image, I'm shooting at a 1.8 right now, and all my background and everything around me is just blown out. You can't really see it. It's very blurry. So that separates me out. If your lens allows you to shoot 1.2, 1.4, 1.8, or even 2.5, you can really get that separation. And that's what will give you those bokeh balls, those little balls of light that you see in the background of those dreamy images. Shooting at a higher f-stop puts everything in focus. It affects your foreground all the way to the background. It's ideal for shooting sun stars, landscapes, architecture, buildings, stuff like that. So what is shutter speed? Shutter is that lovely click that you hear whenever you take a picture. This is typically the setting that I'll hop to next. Shutter speed is essentially how fast that curtain is going to open and close in front of the sensor. Now, we could go into a huge topic on shutter speed, so we'll try and keep it very brief here because shutter speed can control so much. So what is the right shutter speed for what you're shooting? Determine what it is that you're taking a picture of. If you're taking an indoor picture of a cat just sleeping, then a slower shutter speed of like 125 will probably nail it and get everything in focus for you. However, if you're shooting children move pretty quick and they don't really sit still. Shooting something at 1/500 is more likely to get that in focus. Keep in mind that if you want to shoot with a lower shutter speed of typically anything under 1/60th, that you're probably going to need a tripod to help mitigate any of the handshakes that you're going to have whenever you're holding your camera and taking the picture. And with regards to blur, this is one I really hear all the time from people that are just starting out with a camera. My pictures are crap. They always come out blurry. Doesn't matter. I spent $800 on this camera. I spent $3,000 on this camera. Adjusting that shutter speed to something 125 or higher will help you get away from all that blurriness that you're getting in your images. So when it comes to ISO, think of it like a volume knob. Like with volume, if you turn it up too much, the music starts to distort and get all crackly. It just doesn't sound very good. The same thing happens with ISO. When you hit a certain threshold, you introduce too much noise into your picture. You get a bunch of coloring artifacts and noise all over the image. It looks grainy, it's not gonna look good. So whenever you can, try and keep that ISO as low as possible. There's a lot of photographers when it comes to ISO, they always tell you just to keep it under 1200. Anything over that is going to be unusable, and that's simply not true. Technology has come so far within these camera bodies now that you can probably push it up to 3200 ISO in some cameras and get a great usable image. All right, before I go into the examples, I want to show this down here. Just about every camera has this layout. On the Sony, it lays out your shutter speed first, your aperture, your light meter, and your ISO. So we're going to prioritize aperture first. And right now I'm sitting at 1.8. That's where I'm going to want to stay. And you can see my exposure is just underexposed, which is fine. We're going to take the picture here. So you can see his face is in focus. His eyes are kind of in focus, but towards the edges of the skull where his ears would be, you can see that's where the focal plane starts falling away. I'm going to turn down my key light here, and you can see as I drop the key light, the exposure is now super low. We're flashing -2. So to compensate for that, I have 2 options here. I can reduce my shutter speed or I can increase my ISO. We're not gonna mess with the aperture because we want it to stay at 1.8. That's what we want this image to look like. So first I'm going to decrease my shutter speed and show you what that looks like. Going below 125, if you're not on the tripod, you could introduce camera shake with your hands. I'm sitting on a tripod for this, so I can be at 125 or 130 and nail this shot in focus. Okay, so now let's bring our shutter back up to 125 and we'll increase the ISO to brighten our image to the correct exposure. Okay, so let's say we want everything in focus. We're gonna go ahead and bring our aperture up. We'll say F9 should get everything in focus. I'm going to bring my key light up. So even with my key light set to 50%, I'm still -2 on my meter. So for this, I'm going to leave my shutter 125 and I'm going to adjust my ISO. You can see in this picture going up to F9, everything is in focus now. We got the skull, we have the plant, and the fan all in focus. So I'm going to jump over to how ISO affects your image, high ISO and low ISO. So for this example, I'm going to turn my key light down to 1%, and I'm going to go ahead and shut off this backlight I have. And we're going to increase the ISO to expose this image right, just to show you what that looks like. And now you can see the artifact that I was talking about before. With too high of an ISO, you introduce a lot of noise and grain to the image that you just really don't want. So let's get these lights back on. Now we'll cover shutter speed real quick. So I'm gonna bring down my shutter speed to 1/50, focus on the fan. And now you can't see the fan blades at all. They're just, it essentially looks like one amalgamous, one fan blade. Let's bring our shutter speed all the way up to try and stop the fan blades. You can see as I increase my shutter speed, the image gets darker. Should be able to freeze those, I'd hope about 1/1600th. Not quite frozen, but you can see how increasing your shutter speed will freeze motion. Actually, let me just try and get it. I probably will be able to. Let's try 1/4000. Almost frozen. The most important thing is that you take this mode out and you go out and practice with it. Once you understand how everything affects one another and how to nail your exposure, your images are going to come out the way that you want them to, and you can start developing your own style. Be patient with it, start with one setting at a time. That's also to say that there's nothing wrong with the auto modes. There's aperture priority, there's shutter priority. Those modes are fine to start with as well, but manual mode will really get you ingrained with what your camera can do and how you can affect the image. Thank you guys so much for watching. If this helped you out, please hit the like button. It really does help me out. And I'll see you guys later on. Shutter and shutter speed is essentially oh my gosh, I can't say this.